Bob, talk to us about the scene on the inside. Was there any sense of what was happening on the outside?
No,
the fact that this government scrutiny could now be looming.
No, there was nothing about it, and it was, it's developers, right? They're the most enthusiastic fanboys and fangirls that there are at Apple events. So there was a lot of noise and clapping for just about everything that, that Apple showed, particularly for dark mode, which, let's be honest, it's not that big of a deal.
I gotta say, it looks a lot like the Bloomberg terminal.
Yeah, well, there you go. Exactly. It looks cool, and that's great. But, it was interesting because it was a classic case of Apple showing, the glitzy kinds of things they do so well, and yet also playing some serious catch-up on some other areas. You look at things like Apple Maps, you're like, didn't I see that in Android 3 years ago? So, it was one of those cases. But all in all, I think, there's enthusiasm there. They're trying to do some interesting things. They recognize some mistakes. They're actually pulling apart big products like iTunes and iOS. There's iPad OS and iOS for the phone. So, I think they're kind of resetting themselves in a couple different areas. But all in all, it was a reasonable event. To me, I'm a hardware guy, so Mac Pro I thought was very cool.
What about the $1,000 stand? There were some snarky comments about that.
Yeah, so that's the talk of Bloomberg today. So this new Mac Pro is it's base $6,000, $59.99, and then there's this new display, which is $5,000, $49.99. But the display doesn't come with the stand, so I'm not really sure what you do. I don't know, Emily, maybe you want to come to my house and hold it up for me while I work. But you buy this stand, extra $1,000 to put it together.
Right, I cost more than $1,000. Just so you know.
No, I know.
Let's talk about what the significant software changes as you've reported going into this, a new era for the way we access apps, a new era for iTunes, or iTunes sort of going its own way, essentially.
Right.
Talk to us about that.
So a few of the highlight things. One is iPad OS. So to date, you had iOS, which ran on the iPhone, the iPad, and the iPod Touch. So what Apple did is they decided to rebrand the version that runs on the iPad and sort of frame it as its own OS. For all intents and purposes, it's the same iOS as before. They're just changing the name and adding a few new features for iPad users to make it more like a computer. And that's great. But it's to be seen if people are actually going to start ditching their Macs and PCs for iPads in larger numbers because of these changes.
Bob, how significant is this?
Well, Mark brings up a great point. It was the same question I had as I'm sitting there watching this live. Is like, they make these advancements to make the iPad much more computer-like, although missing the mouse still, which is critical. But, so it does become this interesting gray area that you've got between iPads and Mac OS. Now, obviously, on the high end, Apple can push, the Mac Pros and for people who really want it. But in that middle mainstream ground, they're creating more and more question marks. And of course, then there are all the developments around Project Catalyst to enable iPad apps to run on the Mac. So, there's a lot of crossover, which, some people say is good. Other people say, wait a minute, that's kind of confusing. And even with iPad OS, if I'm a developer, now I've got to develop for 5 different OSs if I really want to support all of Apple. watchOS, tvOS, iOS, iPad OS, and Mac OS.
But isn't the idea to make it easier for developers?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for bringing that up. So the good point here is that there's this, what they're calling now Project Catalyst. That's the public name internally for years. And we first reported on this 2 years ago, actually. It was called Marzipan. So the idea is you can develop an iPad application and now run it on the Mac as well by clicking a toolbox in the developer kit. So that should mitigate that a little bit. And the thing about the mouse, so apparently you can connect a mouse as an accessibility feature, not for most users. But the thing that I want to know is, in watching this keynote, some of these gestures and new features are actually kind of confusing. Like, I feel like I'll be able to get the hang of it pretty quickly. You guys will be able to get the hang of it pretty quickly. And the people at Apple who are developing these things obviously know what they're doing. But what about mainstream users, right? What about people coming to the iPad for the first time? People ditching Macs and PCs for these devices? I think it's going to be difficult to sort of get a hang of all these new gestures.
Well, I wonder if it's going to be a sort of generational behavioral shift.
Well, I think there is. I think there's some of that. And, because you're right. I mean, even the demo, the guy trying to grab the text, didn't work, once or twice. So clearly, I think there are things, and then Apple used to talk about how you'd shake your device. I mean, yeah, you get these weird changes over time in terms of interactions that are all efforts to overcome the fact that certain pieces of it aren't quite there on some devices, right? So you have some devices, you have standard means of interacting with them, and other touch-only devices, they're trying to figure out other ways to move forward. Generally Apple is quite good at coming up with these things, but it is still hard to make these changes, exactly as Mark discussed.
They played up privacy, they played up their evolving health offerings. There's a new more natural, completely computer-generated Siri, right? But Mark, what do you think about this antitrust issue? I mean, we don't know a lot about it. We just know that if a probe happened, it would be the DOJ.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this earlier, and I think Apple, even though they're in the crosshairs, it's because they are a big tech company. But one of the things they say on stage, and this is one of the things I happen to believe, is they're not a tech company like the others. If you look at the iPhone market share, the iPhone market share is way less than 50% globally, right? You look at iPad market share, that has come down. You look at Mac market share. The Mac, and if you just looked at it from a pure market share standpoint, is technically a flop, right?
Sub 10, yeah.
You look at the Apple TV, that has low market share. The Apple Watch has high market share, but in terms of like the general antitrust behaviors that you might normally look at, you know, Apple doesn't hit a lot of those checkboxes.
Even though they are the gatekeeper for all of the apps that are used on any Apple device?
That is true, but I think they do make a good argument given that it is their store. Now, they did try to put in some places in terms of the new App Store developments here to make it a little bit more open. They came out with a lot of new developer tools today, and they could easily say, you know, we're going above and beyond any other platform here in order to, you know, be inclusive to developers. So I think I see why on the surface it could be an issue, but if you really look deep in it, I think Apple on this one, just on this one maybe, has a good argument.